Hello, I'm Nick Barratt and I'm here to talk to you about how you can trace the history of your house. Well, your current house, maybe your ancestral home, to tell the stories about who lived there before you, what sort of events unfolded in the local community, and the general context about the changes that might have unfolded over many years, decades, or even centuries if your house is that old. Over the course of this presentation, I'll be talking to you a little bit around why we might want to do this piece of work, as well as run through all the key sources, not just where they're located, but how you can stitch them together to provide timelines of owners, occupiers, and then start to factor in some of that really fascinating social history that will bring your research to life. So let's begin perhaps with that motivation. Why would you want to research the history of your house? Well, over the years and the number of houses I've looked at, there tends to be three main reasons why people get started. The first is historical context. They're fascinated about what stories are locked away in the bricks and mortar inside their homes. Who lived there before? What events took place? And there's this curious transformation as people move from thinking of themselves as owners of a house, as curators of a slice of history. As they find out more about it, the bonds grow with the space, but also with the people, if you like, the ghosts of those before. And they want to pass this knowledge on to the next curators. So there's something fundamental there around understanding the social history in the context of why a house was built, why it was occupied in a certain way, who changed all of that wonderful decoration. And that often leads us on to the next motivation for researching the history of your house or that of your ancestor. What was it like when they lived there? Perhaps the house was redecorated to celebrate a marriage, and we can use a variety of sources, which I'll come on to a bit later, to track down what sort of wallpaper might have been used, what fixtures and fittings decorated the rooms, probate inventories to look at the possessions of our long lost ancestors and almost bring that room back to life. And many people have gone on to redecorate their house in a retrospective style, emulating some of the periods that are most relevant to their story. Finally, knowing the history of your house actually has a practical benefit. And we've seen numerous studies show that if you're coming to sell your house, it's more likely to sell more quickly and possibly at a higher value if you can pass on some information about who lived there before. This is really important if you live in a listed building. There are only a few of those in the country. It's a finite amount of them. So if you can set your house above others in the area by telling a compelling story of a previous owner or occupier, or maybe even who built it, the chances are you're going to find a ready market for your story. So I want to just give you an overview of some of the key topics I'll cover in this lecture. Firstly, a run through of how to get started. It's not quite the same as researching your family history. Then we're going to move on to some of the architectural clues, the physical footprint of your house, which might help you understand when it was built or possibly why it was decorated in a certain way. After that, we're going to move on to building a timeline of owners and occupiers, looking at some of those key sources that should cover most houses before going into a bit more detail and picking up those research clues and going further back and deeper into particular types of record, before then expanding into some of the national events which generate their own records in which your house and possibly your family may also appear. Right, let's get started then. The first thing to do is to gather clues. And some of those clues may be in your own possession. You might have been handed an old title deed package with lists of previous sale dates and owners and occupiers. If you have been, that's a fantastic thing to start with. But also you might need to cast the net a bit further afield. Don't just think of documents. There may be people in the area who were there far before you were and may have stories to tell about previous owners or occupiers. And of course, many local history societies focus on place as much as people. So they might have researched a street or a village and have really important nuggets of information ready for you to look at. One of the key things you'll need to do, though, is to identify your house through time. And that might sound a bit odd, because after all, your house has got a number and a street name, possibly even a house name. But those have not always been consistent. And the further back you go, house numbers fluctuate, they might change over time, they might not even exist. Or alternatively, you might find your house referred to by other older names that might have been lost in modern numbering exercises. Perhaps more importantly than that, you need to think about where your house was located in the local area. Again, that might sound a bit odd because houses tend not to walk around and disappear and move, but the districts around them do. They might change their name. So, for example, one of the key records we'll look at shortly are electoral lists, and parliamentary boundaries will change. So you need to know which parliamentary boundary or ward your house was located in and how that changed over time so you can find the right records. The same applies to other administrative districts. The Poor Law Union will be important. It links very much to the Census Enumerators District. But earlier records are going to be found by thinking more about which manor your house was in. Again, I'll talk about that and whether that manor formed part of a larger estate for which estate records survive. So you need to do some background information. Quite often in a local study centre, county archive, they will have topographical works explaining how these districts formed. And I always find it's then important to go to maps, cartographic visual sources, partly because then you can mark these districts on each map so you know which district relates to which period, but also you can use map sequencing to trace how the area changed over time. So a few top tips. I tend to start with a modern aerial photograph, Google Earth for example, of your house and more importantly the wider area. And as we'll see when we look at some of the methodology, it's important not just to trace your house but maybe neighbouring properties or the whole street, and look out for properties that may well be visible in certain sources such as pubs often appear in directories for example because these become cornerstones of the local area that you can track. But looking at that aerial photograph gives you a sense of how the land lies today, which means you can then start to go back into ordnance survey maps, for example. And the great thing about ordnance survey maps is that they were updated on a regular basis and they were at a large enough scale to spot those minute changes to houses and to streets. So it's really important to sequence your maps from the present back to Ordnance Survey, to the first editions from the 1850s or 1880s, and then possibly using earlier maps. And we'll come on to some of those later on in this session.
We hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please leave a like. To watch the extended uninterrupted version, go to familyhistory.tv, link in the description. You will also find a host of talks from other experts on a variety of subjects. Don't forget to subscribe to get notified when these videos become available.